The quiet village of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, was shrouded in mist one cold November morning when a mysterious document was discovered in the dusty archives of an ancient monastery. The document, a cartulary, contained a series of charters recording the gifts of land and wealth to the monastery by various patrons. But it was not just the land and wealth that caught the attention of the historians. It was the names of people long forgotten, names that whispered of a world where family ties were more than just blood, where trust and loyalty were the true bonds that held society together. In the early Middle Ages, families were not just groups of people related by birth. They were complex networks of trust, obligation, and mutual support. Unlike modern families, which we often think of in terms of biological connections, the families of the early Middle Ages were shaped by the institutions that gave them their form and purpose. Just as the Rockefellers of the 20th century were defined by their trusts and endowments, the families of the early Middle Ages were defined by the monasteries and the lands they supported. One of the most important sources for understanding these families are the Cartularies, or books of charters, that recorded the gifts of land and wealth to monasteries. These documents are like treasure maps, leading us through a maze of names and places that reveal the intricate web of relationships that made up early medieval society. But interpreting these documents is not easy. Modern historians have often tried to fit the information into patterns that make sense to us, such as genealogies and social networks. However, this can be misleading because the early medieval world had a very different understanding of family and kinship. For example, the Cartularies of Saint-Denis show a family named the Carolingians, who were some of the most powerful figures in early medieval Europe. But the names in these documents do not always follow the strict genealogical lines we might expect. Instead, they reveal a world where family was defined by shared interests, common goals, and the need to support each other in a harsh and unpredictable world. The monks who recorded these charters were not just documenting land transactions. They were preserving the memory of a community that was bound together by more than just blood. One of the most fascinating figures in these documents is a woman named Giuda. She lived in the 9th century and wrote a handbook for her son, William, called the Liber Manualis. In this book, Giuda provides a glimpse into the complex world of early medieval family life. She talks about the importance of trust and loyalty, not just to her immediate family, but to the wider community. She advises her son to be cautious with his wealth, and to remember the obligations he has to his family and the people who depend on him. Giuda's words are not just advice for her son. They are a reflection of the values that defined early medieval society. Family was not just a matter of blood. It was a matter of trust. The Cartularies and other documents from this period show that families were often formed through alliances, marriages, and shared interests. These relationships were not always permanent, and they could change over time, but they were essential for survival in a world where political power and economic security were constantly shifting. The early Middle Ages were a time of great upheaval and change. Powerful families like the Carolingians rose and fell, and the boundaries of kingdoms shifted with each new ruler. In this uncertain world, the families that survived were those that could adapt and build strong, resilient networks of trust and support. The Cartularies and other documents from this period are a window into this world, a world where family was not just a matter of biology, but a matter of choice and commitment. As the mist cleared over Saint-Denis, the historians who discovered the Cartulary realized that they were not just reading about a distant past. They were uncovering the roots of the modern world. The families of the early Middle Ages, with their complex networks of trust and loyalty, laid the foundation for the social and political structures that we still see today. The Cartularies are not just historical documents. They are living records of a world where family was the cornerstone of society. In the early medieval period, the land of Francia, which stretched across parts of modern-day France, Germany, and other parts of Western Europe, was filled with important documents called charters. These charters were like ancient contracts or agreements, often about land or gifts given to monasteries. Most of these charters are now lost, but some have survived in special books called cartularies. These cartularies are like old archives that monks used to keep track of all the gifts and land donations they received. The surviving cartularies come from specific places, mostly in the eastern part of the Frankish Empire. For example, there are cartularies from places like Fulda, Freising, and Wissembourg. One particularly important collection of original charters comes from St. Gall, a monastery in Switzerland. These documents are crucial because they tell us about the relationships between people and monasteries during this time. The way these cartularies were organized is also very interesting. They were often arranged by location or district, which reflects how the monks thought about the world around them. For the monks, geography wasn't just about physical places. It was also about sacred space. They saw the land as a manifestation of God's creation, and organizing their records by location was a way of showing their connection to the divine. For example, the cartulary from Mondsee begins with a grand announcement. The Book of Donations begins. These are the men who recommended themselves to this holy place. Then it lists the places in the district, giving us a detailed map of the area. Similarly, the cartulary from Passau starts with the charters of donations to St. Stephen of Rodogau, and then lists the localities. One of the most interesting cartularies is from Freising, compiled by a monk named Khosrow. Khosrow didn't organize his cartulary by district, but he did explain why it was important to keep these records. He wrote that the bishop, Hitto of Freising, wanted to improve all the religious texts and adorn the church with songs and liturgical writing. To do this, the bishop needed to document the gifts that people had given to the church, so that the memory of these generous donors would live on forever. The charters in these cartularies mostly record donations made by individuals, but sometimes they also show gifts made by couples, siblings, parents and children, or uncles and nephews. These charters can tell us about the relationships between people, but they usually only mention a few generations at most. For example, they might mention grandparents, nieces and nephews, or grandchildren, but not much beyond that. It's important to understand that these cartularies weren't just the work of the monks. They were created with the help of the people who made the donations. In the early days, before the 770s, most charters were written by laymen or unaffiliated clerics. Later, when the monks started keeping better records, they often had to collect copies of these earlier charters from the people who had received them. This means that the people who donated land or gifts were actively involved in the process of record keeping. Despite this collaboration, the charters don't always provide a lot of information about family relationships. Historians have tried to fill in the gaps by looking at the names of the people who witnessed the transactions. By studying these names, they can sometimes figure out who was related to whom. However, this method isn't perfect because names were often written differently, and the charters don't always mention titles or relationships. One of the most interesting groups mentioned in the Freising charters is the Huosi. The Huosi were one of the 5 great families in Bavaria, according to the Bavarian laws. They appear in the Freising charters and in other documents from the region. Historians have tried to map out the Huosi family tree by looking at the names of people who donated land and the locations of their properties. For example, a man named Reginpert and his brother Ermenfrid founded a monastery called Scharnitz-Schlehdorf in 763. They donated land in the Tyrol region, and later, a man named Geo donated more land nearby. Historians believe that Geo's father, Popo, was also related to the Huosi. However, this kind of research is not always straightforward. Historians like Carl Schmid and Wilhelm Stormer have debated how to identify the Huosi. Schmid focused on the relationships between individual people, while Stormer believed that the Huosi were a larger group with many connections to important monasteries and churches in Bavaria. The story of the Huosi shows us that the relationships between people and monasteries in early medieval Francia were complex and deeply rooted in local traditions and beliefs. The charters and cartularies are not just dry records. They are windows into a world where people saw their donations as a way to connect with the divine and ensure their place in the afterlife. By studying these documents, we can gain a better understanding of how people in the past thought about their families, their communities, and their place in the world. In the world of ancient Bavaria, the Huosi were a group of people who appeared in documents from the 8th and 9th centuries. These documents, especially from the monastery of Freising, tell us about the Huosi and their interactions with the church. However, figuring out exactly who the Huosi were and how they fit into the broader society is not as straightforward as it might seem. Some historians, like Prince and Stormer, have tried to piece together the Huosi's family tree using names and places mentioned in old charters. They assumed that if people shared the same name, they must be related. For example, they thought that a popo who lived near Assling and a popo who had a son named Geo must be the same person. They also believed that because some people lived in an area called the Huosi district, they must be part of the Huosi group. This method led to some interesting, but often unproven conclusions. Ludwig Halsfertner, another historian, pointed out the problems with this approach. He argued that just because people had the same name, it didn't mean they were related. For instance, if Popo had 5 sons, why did only one of them, Geo, receive property from him? And why were some sons missing from important documents? Halsfertner also noted that the term Huosi district only became associated with southern Bavaria much later, in the High Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, the Huosi district was a smaller area in western Bavaria. The Huosi appear in 2 key documents from Freising. The first, from 791, describes a dispute over a church dedicated to St. Martin. The church was located in a place called Awagos-Usir, which might be modern-day Kienberg. The dispute involved 2 factions of Huosi. One side had 3 brothers, Io, Isankrim, and Urchanbert, along with a man named Kunzo and his children. The other side had Hilteport and Ejulolf. All of them claimed to be co-heirs of the church. When they couldn't resolve the dispute among themselves, they went to Bishop Atto, who referred them to royal officials. After a few days, the officials ruled in favor of Io and his group, and Hilteport and Ejulolf had to give up their shares of the church. The second document, from 849, involves another dispute. A priest named Urchanfrid denied that he had donated property to the church. The donation had been made by his father during the time of Bishop Atto. Urchanfrid had also received properties from Bishop Urchanbert, who called a meeting at a place called Tandern. Many Huosi and other noblemen attended and testified against Urchanfrid. In the end, Urchanfrid had to give the properties back to the church. These documents show that the Huosi were closely tied to local churches and the See of Freising. They were not just a family group, but a community of people who had shared interests in these churches. The disputes over church property reveal that the Huosi's identity and well-being were closely linked to the churches they supported. The Huosi's relationship with Freising is important because the Freising Cartulary, a collection of church documents, was started by Bishop Hitto around 828 and continued by his successor, Bishop Urchanbert. Both bishops were connected to the Huosi. The Cartulary shows how the church and its patrons interacted, often through the exchange of documents and property. Sometimes these interactions were peaceful, but other times they led to disputes and even theft of documents. In the end, the Huosi were not just a family, but a community of people who were deeply involved with the church and its properties. Their relationships and disputes were shaped by their connections to the See of Freising, rather than by a fixed family lineage. Understanding the Huosi requires looking at their interactions with the church and the broader community, rather than trying to trace a single family tree. In the early medieval period, the relationships between powerful families and the church were complex and deeply intertwined. One such family, the Huosi, played a significant role in the region around Freising, a see in what is now southern Germany. Their story is a fascinating example of how families and the church worked together to build and maintain power and influence. The Huosi family had roots that stretched back to the beginnings of the See of Freising. A scholar named Joseph Sturm, in his 1931 study, traced the Huosi's presence in the region through various historical documents and charters. These documents showed that figures like Hitto and Urchanbert, who were part of the Huosi family, were deeply involved in the region's religious and political life. For example, a man named Hitto donated property near Freising, and another Hitto witnessed transactions in nearby areas. These actions suggest that the Huosi had strong ties to the region, and were active participants in the church's affairs. Over time, the Huosi's involvement with the church became even more significant. The See of Freising, often referred to as the Household of St. Mary, Always Virgin, was a central institution that brought people together. It was a place where families could make donations to ensure their souls were remembered and protected. The church, in turn, became a kind of extended family, with the bishops acting as fathers paters to the community. This meant that the Huosi's relationship with the church was not just about donating land or money, It was about becoming part of a spiritual family. One of the key figures in this story is Bishop Hitto, who served as the Bishop of Freising. His sister, Kotzebue, and her daughter, Heilret, also played important roles. In 845, a charter was drawn up that detailed the transfer of a church property from Bishop Hitto to Heilret's grandson, also named Hitto. This document shows how the church and the family worked together to ensure that the property remained within the family, while also serving the church. The new Hitto was raised and educated to serve the church, and the bishop, Erchenberg, who was Hitto's nephew, ensured that the property would be used for the good of the church and the souls of those who had donated it. The story of the Huosi and the See of Freising is not just about a powerful family and a religious institution. It is about how the church acted as a unifying force, bringing together different groups and creating a sense of community. The church did not just accept donations, it became a part of the family's identity. This is evident in the way that the Liber Confraternitatum, a book of remembrance, listed both religious figures and laypeople, men and women, as part of the community of Freising. This list shows that the church saw everyone who contributed to its mission as part of a larger spiritual family. Another important figure in this story is Carl Schmid, a historian who studied the relationship between families and the church. Schmid was particularly interested in how the church's records, like the Liber Confraternitatum, could help identify noble families and their connections. He was surprised to find that the list of the church's brothers included many laypeople and women, which challenged his idea that the church was primarily a place for religious figures. Schmid eventually recognized that the early medieval concept of kinship was deeply spiritual, and that the church's role was to bring people together in a way that transcended biological relationship. The story of the Huosi and the See of Freising is also connected to other regions and families. For example, the Radoins of the Sargau, a family in the center of the Carolingian Empire, had a similar relationship with the monastery of Wissembourg. The Radoins, like the Huosi, used the monastery to create a sense of identity and continuity. The Cartulary of Wissembourg, a collection of charters and documents, shows how the monastery and the Radoins worked together to maintain their influence and power over nearly 2 centuries. In early medieval Europe, the idea of family was not just about blood relations. It was about a shared sense of purpose and community, often centered around a religious institution. The church, with its ability to bind people together through spiritual bonds, played a crucial role in shaping the identities and histories of families like the Huosi and the Radoin. Through their donations and participation in the church's activities, these families became part of a larger, spiritual family that transcended the boundaries of blood and ancestry. The story of the Radoins and the Wissembourg Monastery is a tale of deep, lasting connections that span generations. It's a story about how a family and a religious institution intertwined their destinies, creating a bond that lasted for centuries. In the early 700s, a man named Cradoin made a series of donations to the Wissembourg Monastery. These donations were not just about giving land, they were about securing a place in the monastery's memory and prayers. Cradoin wanted his soul to be remembered, and his name to be written in the Book of Life. His actions set the stage for a relationship that would endure for generations. Cradoin's donations were part of a larger pattern. Monasteries like Wissembourg were not just places of worship, they were centers of power and memory. By donating land, families like the Radoins ensured that they would be remembered, and that their descendants would have a place in the monastic community. This relationship was not one-sided. The monastery, in turn, became the keeper of the family's history and the guarantor of their legacy. The Radoins were not just a family, they were a kin group that spanned several generations. They held properties in the Upper Saar Basin, and their presence in the region was marked by their donations and the praecaria, or temporary grants of land. These praecaria were like leases that allowed family members to use the land during their lifetimes, but the land would ultimately belong to the monastery. This system of grants and donations created a web of obligations and ties between the family and the monastery. One of the most striking examples of this relationship is the Church of St. Martin at Berg. This church, along with its surrounding properties, was a central part of the Radoins' identity. The land was donated by Cradoin's ancestors, and it was passed down through generations in the form of praecaria. Even when there were disputes, such as the one between Cradoin's descendants, Radoin and Gebahart, and the monastery, the relationship was ultimately restored. This shows that the bond between the family and the monastery was strong and resilient. The Radoins were not alone in their relationship with Wissembourg. They were part of a larger network of families, including the so-called Wolfold Gundoins. The Wolfold Gundoins were a prominent group in the region, and their donations to the monastery were closely connected to those of the Radoins. The two families lived in the same area and often interacted with each other. When the Wolfold Gundoins faded from the historical record, their legacy lived on through the Radoins, who continued to hold and manage the properties that had been donated to the monastery. By the mid-800s, the Radoins had become deeply integrated into the life of the Wissembourg monastery. They served as advocates, helping to protect the monastery's interests and manage its properties. This role was not just about power, it was about identity. The Radoins saw themselves as part of the monastic community, and the monastery saw them as an essential part of its history. The Cartulary of Wissembourg, compiled in the 860s, is a testament to this relationship. It is not just a collection of documents, it is a story that connects the past to the present. The charters of the Radoins and the Wolfold Gundoins are interwoven, showing that the copyist saw these families as part of a single, continuous narrative. The Radoins, who were still active when the Cartulary was compiled, played a role in its creation, ensuring that their family's story would be preserved for future generations. In the end, the story of the Radoins and Wissembourg is a story of mutual dependence and shared memory. The family and the monastery supported each other, and their histories are intertwined in a way that transcends the boundaries of time. The Radoins and the monastery are a reminder that the bonds we form with institutions and communities can have a lasting impact, shaping the lives of generations to come.